Hannah clutched her stomach as an unbearable pain shot through her abdomen. The agony was unlike anything she had ever experienced before, a searing, twisting sensation that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. She gasped for air, feeling as if a knife was being twisted deep within her core, each breath bringing a fresh wave of torment. The bright lights of her bedroom blurred as tears filled her eyes, the familiar surroundings becoming a hazy, indistinct backdrop to her suffering. The pain consumed her entire being, leaving no room for rational thought or calm consideration. In that moment, Hannah was reduced to nothing more than a vessel of pure, unadulterated agony. Desperately, she called out for her mother, Sandra. Her voice, usually strong and clear, came out as a strangled cry, barely audible above the pounding of her own heart in her ears. "Mom," she managed to choke out, her fingers clawing at the bedsheets as another spasm racked her body. Sandra rushed into the room, her face pale with concern. The sight that greeted her was one that would be etched into her memory forever. Her daughter, usually so vibrant and full of life, now reduced to a writhing, pain-stricken figure on the bed. Hannah's contorted face and trembling hands sparked a primal panic in Sandra's heart, a mother's instinct screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Without hesitation, Sandra quickly reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed for an ambulance. As she waited for the call to connect, her free hand found Hannah's, squeezing it tightly in a futile attempt to transfer some comfort, some strength to her suffering child. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Help is on the way." The minutes that followed seemed to stretch into an eternity. Sandra found herself caught in a surreal bubble of time, where each second dragged on endlessly, yet simultaneously rushed by in a blur. She alternated between soothing her daughter with gentle words and frantically relaying information to the emergency dispatcher on the phone. As Hannah's pain intensified, so did Sandra's fear. She watched helplessly as her daughter's face grew paler, her lips taking on a worrying bluish tinge. Sweat beaded on Hannah's forehead, plastering her dark hair to her skin in damp tendrils. Sandra's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it her appendix? Food poisoning? Something even worse? The sound of sirens in the distance brought a wave of relief crashing over Sandra. Help was nearly here. She squeezed Hannah's hand once more, willing her strength into her daughter's trembling form. "Just hold on a little longer, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're almost here." As the paramedics burst into the room, Sandra felt a strange mix of relief and renewed fear. The sight of the uniformed professionals with their equipment and calm demeanor was reassuring. Yet their presence also made the situation terrifyingly real. This wasn't just a bad dream or a momentary scare. Her daughter was in serious danger. Sandra watched as the paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, their hands gentle but sure as they assessed Hannah's condition. Their voices seemed to come from far away as they asked questions and relayed information to each other in a language of medical jargon that Sandra could barely comprehend. In what seemed like both an instant and an eternity, Hannah was being carefully transferred onto a stretcher. Sandra moved as if in a trance, following the paramedics as they carried her daughter out of the house and into the waiting ambulance. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of fear and pain that had permeated Hannah's bedroom. As the ambulance doors closed behind them, Sandra found herself in a new world of flashing lights and urgent voices. She held tight to Hannah's hand, her heart breaking at every whimper of pain that escaped her daughter's lips. The journey to the hospital was a blur of sirens and worried glances, each bump in the road eliciting a fresh groan of agony from Hannah. Sandra's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts and fears. How had this happened? What could have caused such sudden, intense pain? Would Hannah be all right? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswerable and relentless. All she could do was hold on to her daughter's hand and pray that whatever was wrong could be fixed. As the ambulance sped through the night, Sandra found herself reflecting on the fragility of life. Just hours ago, Hannah had been laughing and chatting about her day at school. Now, she lay pale and trembling, fighting against a pain that threatened to overwhelm her. The stark contrast was almost too much for Sandra to bear. She thought of all the moments she had taken for granted, the casual conversations over breakfast, the shared laughter at silly jokes, the quiet evenings spent together reading or watching TV. In this moment of crisis, those simple, everyday occurrences seemed like precious treasures, glowing with a warmth and beauty that Sandra had never fully appreciated before. As they neared the hospital, Sandra made a silent vow. If, no, when, Hannah recovered from this, she would never again take a single moment with her daughter for granted. Every shared smile, every hug, every whispered "I love you" would be cherished and held close to her heart. The ambulance came to a stop, and suddenly they were surrounded by a flurry of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around them, their voices urgent but reassuring. Sandra felt Hannah's hand slip from hers as her daughter was wheeled away, disappearing through a set of imposing double doors. Left alone in the bustling emergency room, Sandra felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. All she could do now was wait, hope, and pray. As she sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, her eyes fixed on those ominous doors, Sandra prepared herself for what promised to be the longest night of her life. The ambulance sirens wailed, piercing the quiet night as Hannah was rushed to the hospital. The sound, usually a distant background noise in their suburban neighborhood, now took on a terrifying immediacy. For Sandra, sitting beside her daughter in the speeding vehicle, each wail seemed to echo the fear in her own heart. Inside the ambulance, a flurry of activity surrounded Hannah. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors and administering medication to help manage her pain. The beeping of machines and the urgent voices of the medical staff created a cacophony that only added to the surreal nature of the situation. Hannah, for her part, was barely conscious of her surroundings. The pain in her abdomen had become an all-consuming entity, leaving little room for coherent thought. She was vaguely aware of her mother's presence, the comforting pressure of Sandra's hand in hers serving as an anchor in the storm of agony that threatened to sweep her away. As they arrived at the hospital, Hannah was quickly whisked away to the emergency room. Sandra found herself jogging to keep up with the stretcher, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The bright lights and antiseptic smell of the hospital assaulted her senses, adding to the overwhelming nature of the situation. In the emergency room, doctors worked quickly to diagnose Hannah. Their movements were swift and sure, their voices calm and professional as they examined her and ordered tests. Sandra watched from the sidelines, feeling helpless and out of place in this sterile, clinical environment. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Sandra waited for news. Minutes stretched into hours, each tick of the clock on the wall feeling like an eternity. She alternated between pacing the waiting room floor and sitting with her head in her hands, trying to quell the rising tide of panic in her chest. Finally, after what felt like days but was in reality only a few hours, a doctor approached Sandra. His face was serious but not grim, and Sandra felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. "Mrs. Thompson," the doctor said, his voice kind but professional. "We've completed our examination and tests on your daughter. Hannah is suffering from acute appendicitis. We need to schedule surgery immediately." The word surgery hit Sandra like a physical blow. Despite the seriousness of the situation, a part of her had been clinging to the hope that this was all a mistake, that Hannah would be fine with some rest and medication. The reality of the situation came crashing down around her. "Surgery?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Is it dangerous?" The doctor's expression softened slightly. "Appendectomy is a very common procedure," he assured her. "But given the severity of Hannah's condition, we need to act quickly to prevent any complications. I assure you we have an excellent surgical team who will take the best care of your daughter." Sandra nodded, trying to draw strength from the doctor's confidence. "Can I see her before?" she asked, unable to finish the sentence. "Of course," the doctor replied. "We're preparing her for surgery now. You can have a few minutes with her before we take her to the operating room." Following the doctor, Sandra was led to a curtained-off area where Hannah lay on a hospital bed. The sight of her daughter, pale and small against the stark white sheets, nearly broke Sandra's heart. But she forced a smile as she approached, determined to be strong for Hannah's sake. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly, taking Hannah's hand in hers. How are you feeling? Hannah's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and the effects of the medication she'd been given. Mom, she murmured, her voice weak and uncertain. What's happening? Sandra swallowed hard, pushing back the lump in her throat. You have appendicitis, honey, she explained gently. The doctors need to do surgery to make you better. But don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Hannah's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Surgery? She repeated, her voice small and frightened. Yes, but it's a very common operation, Sandra reassured her, echoing the doctor's words. You'll be asleep the whole time, and when you wake up, you'll start feeling much better. Hannah nodded slowly, seeming to draw comfort from her mother's words. Will you be here when I wake up? She asked, her fingers tightening around Sandra's. Of course, sweetheart, Sandra promised, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Hannah's forehead. I'll be right here waiting for you. You just focus on getting better, okay? Before Hannah could respond, a nurse appeared, informing them that it was time to move to the operating room. Sandra felt her heart constrict as she was asked to say her goodbyes. She gave Hannah's hand one last squeeze, forcing a brave smile onto her face. I love you, Hannah, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll see you soon. As Hannah was wheeled away, Sandra found herself alone once again in the bustling hospital. She made her way back to the waiting room, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hours ahead promised to be some of the longest of her life, filled with worry and desperate hope. Settling into an uncomfortable chair, Sandra closed her eyes and offered up a silent prayer. Please, she thought, let Hannah be okay. Let this surgery be successful. As the minutes ticked by, Sandra prepared herself for the agonizing wait, clinging to the hope that soon this nightmare would be over and her daughter would be on the path to recovery. Days after the surgery, Hannah was discharged from the hospital, the acute crisis of her appendicitis apparently resolved. Yet as she settled back into the familiar surroundings of her home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The sharp, stabbing pain that had sent her to the emergency room was gone, replaced by a dull, persistent discomfort that seemed to permeate her entire being. Hannah found herself constantly tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to alleviate. She would wake in the mornings feeling as if she hadn't slept at all, her body heavy and unresponsive. The simple act of getting out of bed became a monumental task, requiring every ounce of willpower she could muster. Accompanying this fatigue was a persistent nausea that turned even the thought of food into a source of misery. The mere smell of cooking would send her stomach churning, and meals that she had once enjoyed now seemed utterly unappetizing. Hannah found herself picking at her food, managing only a few bites before pushing her plate away, much to her mother's growing concern. Sandra noticed her daughter's declining health with increasing alarm. She had expected some recovery time after the surgery, but Hannah seemed to be getting worse rather than better. The vibrant, energetic girl she knew had been replaced by a pale, listless shadow, moving through the days with visible effort. Hannah, honey, Sandra would say, her voice laced with worry. Are you sure you're feeling all right? Maybe we should call the doctor. But Hannah would just shake her head, forcing a weak smile. I'm fine, Mom, she'd insist. Just tired. It's probably just from the surgery, you know? But as the days went by, it became increasingly clear that this was more than just post-operative fatigue. Hannah's nausea worsened, particularly in the mornings. She would wake up feeling dizzy and sick, often having to rush to the bathroom as soon as she got out of bed. The sight of her daughter hunched over the toilet, retching miserably, broke Sandra's heart and intensified her worry. Hannah's body felt alien to her, sluggish and unresponsive. Simple tasks that she had once performed without thought now required concentrated effort. She found herself out of breath after climbing the stairs, her heart racing as if she'd run a marathon. Her clothes began to feel tight and uncomfortable, adding to her general sense of discomfort and unease. Despite the surgery that was supposed to have cured her, Hannah felt worse with each passing day. The persistent nausea, the bone-deep fatigue, the general feeling of wrongness in her body, all of it combined to leave her confused and increasingly anxious. She had expected to feel better after the appendectomy, to return to her normal life. Instead, She felt as if she was sinking deeper into an inexplicable malaise. Hannah's friends and teachers at school began to notice the change in her as well. Once an active participant in class discussions, she now sat quietly, often seeming distracted or distant. Her usual enthusiasm for sports and extracurricular activities had vanished, replaced by a desire to go home and sleep as soon as the school day ended. "Are you okay, Hannah?" Her best friend Lily asked one day at lunch, noticing how Hannah was listlessly pushing her food around her plate without eating. "You've seemed really off lately." Hannah attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she insisted, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. "Just still recovering from the surgery, I guess." But even as she said it, Hannah knew it wasn't true. This didn't feel like recovery. If anything, it felt like she was getting sicker, caught in the grip of some mysterious ailment that she couldn't understand or explain. As the weeks went by, Hannah's symptoms showed no sign of abating. The constant nausea, the overwhelming fatigue, the feeling of her body changing in ways she couldn't comprehend, all of it combined to create a persistent anxiety that gnawed at her day and night. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with worries and unanswerable questions. What was happening to her? Why wasn't she getting better? Was there something seriously wrong? Something the doctors had missed? The possibilities her mind conjured in the dark hours of the night were terrifying, each scenario more dire than the last. Sandra, watching her daughter's continued decline with growing alarm, finally decided that enough was enough. Despite Hannah's protests that she was fine, that it was probably just taking longer to recover from the surgery than expected, Sandra knew in her heart that something was seriously wrong. "That's it," she declared one morning, after finding Hannah once again hunched over the toilet. "We're going back to the doctor. This isn't normal, Hannah, and we need to find out what's going on." Hannah, too tired and miserable to argue, simply nodded. As much as she had tried to convince herself and others that she was fine, she knew deep down that her mother was right. Something was wrong, and the not knowing was almost as bad as the physical symptoms. As Sandra made the appointment, Hannah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief that something was finally being done, that perhaps she would get answers to what was happening to her body. But also a deep, gnawing fear of what those answers might be. Little did Hannah know that the truth awaiting her was beyond anything she could have imagined, a revelation that would change the course of her life forever. Sandra Thompson had always prided herself on her intuition, especially when it came to her daughter. From the moment Hannah was born, Sandra had felt a deep, almost psychic connection to her child. She could sense when Hannah was upset, even before the first tear fell. She knew when her daughter was hiding something, could read the subtle changes in her expression and body language like an open book. It was this finely tuned maternal instinct that now set alarm bells ringing in Sandra's mind. As she watched Hannah stumble out of the bathroom after another bout of morning sickness, Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in her mind, forming a picture that was both shocking and terrifying in its implications. The persistent nausea, especially in the mornings. The fatigue that seemed to consume Hannah's every waking moment. The subtle changes in her daughter's body that Sandra had noticed but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. All of it pointed to a possibility that Sandra could barely bring herself to consider. Frustrated by the lack of answers from doctors and scared by the deterioration of Hannah's health, Sandra decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach, a mother's intuition screaming at her to look beyond the obvious. That afternoon, after dropping Hannah off at school, Sandra found herself driving aimlessly, her mind a whirlwind of worry and speculation. Almost without conscious thought, she found herself pulling into the parking lot of a local pharmacy. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the engine, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Sandra got out of the car and walked into the store. The fluorescent light seemed overly bright, the cheerful music playing over the speakers a stark contrast to the turmoil in her heart. She moved through the aisles on autopilot, her feet carrying her to a section she had never imagined she'd be visiting for her 17-year-old daughter. Standing before the family planning section, Sandra felt a wave of unreality wash over her. This couldn't be happening. It had to be something else. anything else. But the voice of her intuition, the same one that had guided her through countless parenting challenges, wouldn't be silenced. With a shaking hand, Sandra reached out and picked up a pregnancy test. The small box felt impossibly heavy in her hand, laden with the weight of potential life-altering consequences. She quickly made her way to the checkout, avoiding eye contact with the cashier, feeling irrationally as if her fears were written across her face for all to see. The drive home was a blur, Sandra's mind racing with possibilities and implications. How would she broach this subject with Hannah? What if she was wrong? And perhaps most terrifyingly, what if she was right? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswerable and relentless. As she pulled into the driveway of their home, Sandra took a moment to collect herself. She glanced at the small paper bag on the passenger seat, containing the test that could potentially change everything. With a deep breath, she steeled herself for what was to come. That evening, after a tense and quiet dinner where Hannah once again barely touched her food, Sandra knew it was time. She retrieved the small box from where she had hidden it in her bedroom and made her way to Hannah's room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knocked softly on the door. "Hannah, can I come in?" she called, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil within. "Sure, Mom," came the reply, Hannah's voice sounding tired and distant. Sandra opened the door to find Hannah lying on her bed, looking pale and drawn. The sight of her daughter, so unlike the vibrant girl she had been just weeks ago, strengthened Sandra's resolve. They needed answers, no matter how difficult they might be to face. "Honey, we need to talk," Sandra began, sitting on the edge of the bed. She placed the small box containing the pregnancy test on the bedside table, her eyes never leaving Hannah's face. Hannah's gaze flickered to the box, confusion evident in her expression. "Mom, what's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sandra took a deep breath, her heart breaking at the fear and uncertainty she saw in her daughter's eyes. "It's a pregnancy test, sweetheart," she said gently. I think we need to consider all possibilities for why you've been feeling so unwell." Hannah's eyes widened, a mix of shock, disbelief, and something else, something that looked alarmingly like recognition, flashing across her face. But that's impossible," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I can't be. I haven't." Sandra reached out and took Hannah's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I know this is scary, honey," she said softly. "But we need to know. Whatever the result, we'll face it together, okay?" Hannah stared at the box for a long moment, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, she nodded slowly, her hand tightening around Sandra's. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sandra handed her the small box, her heart aching at the tremor in Hannah's hands as she took it. "Just take it," Sandra said, her voice firm yet filled with concern. "Whatever happens, whatever the result, I'm here for you. We'll get through this together." As Hannah disappeared into the bathroom, pregnancy test in hand, Sandra sank onto the bed, her mind reeling. In just a few minutes, their lives could change forever. All she could do now was wait, and pray that whatever the outcome, they would have the strength to face it together. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the gloomy weather mirroring the somber mood that had settled over the Thompson household. Hannah sat in the quiet bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her hands. The small plastic stick seemed to mock her, its innocent appearance belying the power it held to completely upend her life. Her heart raced, its frantic rhythm echoing in her ears. Her palms were slick with sweat, making it difficult to keep a firm grip on the test. Hannah tried to steady her breath, drawing in deep, shaky inhalations in an attempt to calm her frayed nerves. But the magnitude of the moment weighed heavily upon her, making each breath feel like a monumental effort. She told herself it was impossible, that there had to be some other explanation for her symptoms. Yet a small voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise, bringing forth memories she had desperately tried to suppress. A party, a boy, too much to drink. No, she pushed the thoughts away. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. With trembling hands, Hannah slowly opened the test and followed the instructions. The simple act of reading the directions felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else go through the motions. This couldn't be happening to her. She was Hannah Thompson, good student, responsible daughter, with plans for college and a bright future ahead. This sort of thing didn't happen to girls like her. As she waited for the result, minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Hannah's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more overwhelming than the last. What would her mother say? Her father? Her friends? How could she face everyone at school? And what about her plans for the future, college, career, all the dreams she had nurtured for so long? The timer on her phone buzzed, startling Hannah out of her spiraling thoughts. It was time. With a deep breath, she picked up the test, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. For a moment, she closed her eyes, offering up a silent prayer to any higher power that might be listening. Please, she thought desperately, please let it be negative. Slowly, Hannah opened her eyes and looked down at the test. The world seemed to stop spinning as she stared at the result, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. 2 lines, clear as day, positive. The test revealed the unthinkable. Hannah was pregnant. For a long moment, Hannah sat frozen, unable to move or even breathe. The positive result stared back at her, unwavering and undeniable. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the bathroom tiles swaying beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake, a faulty test, a bad dream she would wake up from any moment. But as the seconds ticked by and reality refused to shift, the truth began to sink in. She was pregnant, at 17, still in high school, with her whole life ahead of her. Pregnant. A sob bubbled up from deep within her chest, breaking free despite her best efforts to contain it. Once it started, she couldn't stop. Tears streamed down her face as she curled in on herself, her body shaking with the force of her cries. All the fear, confusion, and overwhelming panic she had been holding back for weeks came pouring out in a torrent of emotion. How had this happened? Well, she knew how it had happened, of course. That night at the party, the one she had tried so hard to forget. She had been so careful her whole life, always the responsible one. But one night of poor judgment, of letting her guard down, and now, this. Through her tears, Hannah's mind raced with questions and fears. How far along was she? What were her options? How could she tell her parents? The thought of facing her mother, of seeing the disappointment in her eyes, sent a fresh wave of sobs racking through her body. And what about the father? The boy from the party. She barely knew him. How could she tell him? Would he even care? The possibilities of his reaction, ranging from indifference to anger, only added to her distress. As the initial shock began to subside, a new emotion began to take hold. Determination. Hannah took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm herself. She needed to think, to plan. She couldn't stay in this bathroom forever, no matter how much she wanted to hide from the world. Wiping her tears with a trembling hand, Hannah stood up on shaky legs. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the pale, tear-stained face that stared back at her. In that moment, she made a decision. Whatever happened next, whatever choice she made, she would face it head-on. She had to be strong now, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. With one last deep breath, Hannah opened the bathroom door. The positive test felt like it weighed a ton in her hand as she walked out, her steps slow and hesitant. She knew her mother would be waiting, worry etched on her face. It was time to face the music, to speak aloud the truth that would change everything. As she made her way down the hallway, Hannah's mind whirled with the enormity of what lay ahead. Her life as she knew it was over. A new chapter was beginning, one filled with uncertainty and challenges she had never imagined facing at 17. But as terrifying as it was, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, her mother would be by her side. With that thought giving her strength, Hannah stepped into the living room, ready to share the news that would alter the course of not just her life, but the lives of everyone she loved. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with tough decisions and unforeseen obstacles. But in that moment, as she prepared to speak the words that would change everything, Hannah found a well of strength within herself that she never knew existed. She was scared, yes. Overwhelmed, certainly. But she was also Hannah Thompson, strong, resilient, and capable of facing whatever life threw her way. With a deep breath, she looked into her mother's eyes and began to speak, taking the first step on a journey that would redefine her life in ways she could never have imagined. Hannah's world felt like it was spinning out of control as she sat in stunned silence, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. The positive pregnancy test, now discarded on the coffee table, seemed to mock her with its life-altering implications. She felt disconnected from her body, as if she were watching the scene unfold from somewhere far away. She walked out of the bathroom, pale and trembling, clutching the positive test like a lifeline. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet house, each step feeling like a monumental effort. As she entered the living room, her eyes immediately sought out her mother. Sandra, seeing her daughter's face, immediately understood the result. The hope she had been clinging to, that this was all a mistake, a false alarm, evaporated in an instant. A flood of emotions washed over both of them, fear, confusion, and disbelief chief among them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and overwhelming emotions. Hannah stood frozen, the positive test still clutched in her trembling hand, unable to meet her mother's eyes. Sandra sat on the couch, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, worry for her daughter warring with the shock of the situation. Finally, it was Hannah who broke the silence. "Mom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, making the situation real in a way it hadn't been before. As soon as the words left her mouth, Hannah broke down. The tears she had been holding back came in a torrent, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. In an instant, Sandra was by her side, wrapping her arms around her daughter and pulling her close. "Oh, Hannah," Sandra murmured, her own eyes filling with tears. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll figure this out. We'll get through this together." Hannah clung to her mother, burying her face in Sandra's shoulder as years of pent-up emotion poured out of her. All the fear, confusion, and overwhelming panic she had been feeling for weeks came rushing to the surface. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she sobbed. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm so scared." Sandra held her daughter tightly, her heart breaking at Hannah's distress. "I know, baby," she soothed, running her hand over Hannah's hair. "I know you're scared, but you're not alone in this. I'm right here with you, every step of the way." As Hannah's sobs gradually subsided, Sandra gently led her to the couch. They sat side by side, Sandra never letting go of Hannah's hand. "Tell me everything," Sandra said softly. "When did this happen? Do you know who the father is?" Hannah took a shaky breath, wiping her eyes with her free hand. "There was a party," she began hesitantly. "About 2 months ago, I had too much to drink. There was this boy." She trailed off, unable to meet her mother's eyes. Sandra squeezed Hannah's hand reassuringly. "It's okay," she said gently. "You can tell me anything, Hannah. I'm not here to judge you. I just want to understand so I can help." Encouraged by her mother's words, Hannah continued. She told Sandra about the party, about the boy she barely knew, about waking up the next morning with fragmented memories and a deep sense of regret. As she spoke, the weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks began to lift slightly. It felt good to finally share the truth, to no longer carry the burden alone. When Hannah finished speaking, Sandra was quiet for a moment, processing everything she had heard. "Oh, Hannah," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish you had felt you could come to me sooner. But what's done is done. Now we need to focus on moving forward." Hannah looked up at her mother, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "What are we going to do, Mom?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. I can't have a baby. I'm only 17. What about school? What about college? What about my whole life?" Sandra took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Those are all valid concerns, Hannah, she said, and they're all things we need to consider. But right now, the most important thing is your health and well-being. We need to get you to a doctor, confirm the pregnancy, and discuss your options. The word options hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Hannah nodded slowly, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. She hadn't even begun to think about what she wanted to do, what choice she would make. The very idea of making such a monumental decision was overwhelming. "Whatever you decide," Sandra continued, her voice firm but gentle, "I want you to know that I'm here for you. This isn't going to be easy, Hannah. There are going to be tough times ahead, no matter what choice you make. But you're not alone in this. We're in this together." Hannah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Despite the fear and uncertainty that still churned in her stomach, her mother's unwavering support was like a lifeline. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Sandra pulled Hannah into another hug, holding her daughter close. "You're stronger than you know, Hannah," she murmured. "We both are. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." As they sat there, mother and daughter united in the face of an uncertain future, Hannah felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges she had never imagined facing at 17. But with her mother by her side, she felt a little less afraid, a little more capable of facing whatever lay ahead. They decided to visit the doctor to confirm the pregnancy and understand what lay ahead. As Hannah prepared for the appointment that would set the course for the next chapter of her life, she found herself reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions she had experienced in such a short time: fear, confusion, despair, but also, unexpectedly, a tiny spark of something else. Something that felt almost like strength. Whatever happened next, whatever choice she made, Hannah knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. With her mother's support and her own newfound determination, she would face this challenge head-on. As they prepared to leave for the doctor's appointment, Hannah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. This was the first step on a long and uncertain journey, but she was ready to take it. At the doctor's office, the pregnancy was confirmed, leaving Hannah overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. The doctor's words seemed to come from far away as she explained Hannah's options and the timeline they were working with. Sandra sat beside her daughter, her hand a comforting presence on Hannah's arm, grounding her in the midst of the whirlwind of information. As they left the clinic, Hannah felt as if she were walking in a daze. The reality of her situation had been confirmed in black and white, leaving no room for denial or wishful thinking. She was pregnant, at 17. The words echoed in her mind, still feeling surreal despite the medical confirmation. The doctor had assured her that everything could be managed, regardless of the path she chose. But Hannah felt woefully unprepared for the decisions that lay ahead. How could she possibly be ready to make choices that would affect the rest of her life, when just weeks ago her biggest concern had been passing her calculus exam? As the days passed, Hannah began to grapple with the reality of her situation. The initial shock gave way to a tumult of emotions: fear, uncertainty, but also, surprisingly, moments of cautious hope. She found herself thinking about the future in ways she never had before, considering possibilities that had never crossed her mind. Sandra supported her every step of the way, providing a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on when the emotions became too much to bear. They spent long nights talking, discussing options, fears, and hopes. Sandra never pushed Hannah in any particular direction, instead offering information and support to help her daughter make her own informed decision. Slowly, Hannah started to accept that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. The path she had always envisioned for herself, graduation, college, career, now had a fork in it, leading to uncharted territory. It was terrifying, but also, in moments of quiet reflection, somewhat exhilarating. She began to research her options thoroughly, reading everything she could get her hands on about teen pregnancy, adoption, and parenting. She joined online support groups, finding comfort in the stories of other young women who had faced similar circumstances. Their experiences, both positive and negative, helped Hannah gain perspective on her own situation. As the weeks went by, Hannah found herself growing stronger. The girl who had once been paralyzed by fear and indecision was slowly being replaced by a young woman who was learning to face challenges head-on. She began to see this unexpected turn of events not just as a crisis, but as an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. Sandra watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and awe, though her heart ached for the challenges her daughter faced. She couldn't help but admire Hannah's resilience and determination. The bond between mother and daughter grew stronger than ever, forged in the fire of shared adversity. Finally, after weeks of soul-searching and careful consideration, Hannah made her decision. Whatever path she had chosen, she knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles to overcome, sacrifices to make, and moments of doubt. But as she shared her choice with her mother, Hannah felt a sense of peace settle over her. This wasn't the future she had planned for herself. It wasn't the path she would have chosen. But it was her reality now, and she was determined to face it with courage and grace. As Hannah stood at the threshold of this new chapter in her life, she reflected on the whirlwind journey of the past few months. From the terrifying moment of discovery to the depths of despair, and finally to this point of acceptance and determination. It had been a transformative experience. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging. There would be difficult conversations to have with her father, her friends, her teachers. There would be plans to adjust, dreams to reimagine. But Hannah felt ready to face whatever came her way. With her mother by her side and a newfound strength within herself, Hannah faced the uncertainty ahead, ready to embark on this new chapter of her life. As she took her first steps into this uncharted future, she carried with her the knowledge that life's greatest challenges often lead to its most profound growth. Whatever lay ahead, Hannah Thompson was ready to face it. She had discovered a resilience within herself that she never knew existed, a strength born from adversity. And as she stood on the brink of this new beginning, she felt, for the first time in months, a glimmer of excitement for what the future might hold. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with ups and downs, triumphs and setbacks. But Hannah was no longer the scared girl she had been when this all began. She was stronger now, wiser, and ready to write the next chapter of her life on her own terms. As the sun set on this day, casting a warm glow over the world outside her window, Hannah placed a hand on her stomach. Whatever choice she had made, whatever path she had chosen, she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. And somehow, despite all the fear and uncertainty, she found herself looking forward to the journey ahead. With a deep breath and a determined spirit, Hannah Thompson stepped forward into her future, ready to face whatever challenges and joys it might bring. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she was ready to walk it one step at a time.